In the winter of 1898, a lighthouse keeper on the coast of Maine began recording strange occurrences in his log. Night after night, something emerged from the Atlantic and scraped against the tower walls. He found scales the size of dinner plates wedged in the rocks. His final entry, discovered 3 weeks after the lighthouse went dark, read, "It has learned to knock in the rhythm of my footsteps." What follows is drawn from his journal and the testimony of the supply boat captain who found the tower empty, the lens still turning, and the keeper's boots placed neatly by the door. So before we continue, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe to support the channel. Thanks. I took the posting at Portland Headlight in October of 1898, with a clean record and a need for solitude that came from too many years in crowded harbors. The Lighthouse board sent a letter with coordinates, supply schedules, and a brief note that the previous keeper had requested transfer after only 4 months. No explanation given. The pay was fair. The work was simple. Keep the lens turning, the oil burning, and the log current. I arrived on a gray afternoon when the sea lay flat and heavy under low clouds. The supply boat left me at the dock with 3 crates of provisions, 2 barrels of lamp oil, and a canvas bag of mail that had accumulated for the position. The captain, a man named Briggs, with salt white whiskers and hands like knotted rope, helped me unload without much talk. When the last crate hit the dock, he looked up at the tower and then at me. He said the light had a reputation for being lonely. He said some men handled it better than others. He said he would return in 3 weeks with fresh supplies and to check the lens. Then he pushed off and motored back toward the harbor, leaving a wake that rocked the dock for a full minute after he disappeared. The lighthouse stood on a granite point that jutted into the Atlantic like a broken tooth. Waves hit the rocks at all hours, throwing spray high enough to miss the windows at the tower's base. The keeper's house sat 30 yards back from the light, a small structure with a wood stove, a cot, a table, and shelves for stores. The walls were thick stone. The roof was slate. It would hold against any storm the coast could throw. I spent the first week learning the rhythm of the place. The lens turned on a clockwork mechanism powered by weights that descended through the center of the tower. Every 4 hours, I climbed the spiral stairs and wound the system with a hand crank, 60 turns to raise the weights back to the top. The lamp burned whale oil in a brass reservoir that needed filling twice per night. The wick required trimming at dusk. The glass panels of the lens had to be cleaned each morning to remove salt residue. The work left my hands smelling of oil and brass polish. My boots echoed on the iron stairs. At night, I sat in the watchroom below the lens and read or made notes in the log. The beam swept across the water in a steady pattern. 3 seconds of light, 2 seconds of darkness, repeat. Ships far out on the horizon blinked their running lights in answer. The solitude did not trouble me. I had spent years on merchant vessels with crews that talked too much and listened too little. Here, the only sounds were wind, waves, and the slow ticking of the clockwork. I kept the log with care, noting weather conditions, passing ships, and maintenance tasks. The pages were clean and orderly. On the 8th night, I heard the first scrape. I was sitting at the table in the keeper's house, eating a supper of salt pork and hardtack, when the sound came through the wall. Low and drawn out, like a blade pulled across stone. It lasted 3 seconds, then stopped. I set my fork down and listened. The wind pressed against the windows. The stove crackled. Nothing more. I went outside with a lantern and walked the perimeter of the light. The beams swept overhead, throwing my shadow long across the rocks. I found nothing out of place. No loose shutters, no debris caught in the eaves. I returned to the house and finished my meal, telling myself it had been the wind or a piece of driftwood caught in the rocks below. The scrape came again the next night, and the night after that, always after dark, always from the direction of the tower. I began timing it with my pocket watch. It occurred between 11 and midnight, lasting anywhere from 3 to 10 seconds. The sound had weight to it, a grinding pressure that carried through stone. On the fourth night, I stood outside the tower with the lantern and waited. The air was cold and damp. The beam turned above me, lighting the rocks and the black water beyond. At 11:30, the scrape began. I moved along the base of the tower, following the sound. It seemed to come from the seaward side, where the rocks dropped straight into deep water. I leaned over the edge and held the lantern low. The light caught the wet surface of the granite and the white foam where waves surged against the base. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then the water swelled, and something large moved just beneath the surface. Not a whale. The shape was wrong. Too long in the body, too angular. It sank back into the dark before I could fix its outline. The scrape stopped. I stayed at the edge for another 10 minutes, but the water showed only the usual rhythm of swells. I went back inside and made a note in the log. Unusual sound from base of tower. Possible debris or large marine animal. Will monitor. I began finding the scales 3 days later. The first one lay wedged in a crack between two granite blocks near the base of the tower. It was roughly circular, the size of a dinner plate, with a surface that caught the light in shifting colors: green, blue, black. The edges were smooth and hard as glass. I pried it loose with a scraper and brought it inside. The scale had weight to it, more than I expected. The surface was cool to the touch and faintly slick, like wet leather. I set it on the table and examined it under lamplight. The texture suggested fish, but no fish I knew carried scales this large. I had seen tuna and swordfish hauled onto docks from New Bedford to Eastport. This was something else. I found 2 more scales over the next week, both near the waterline. I stored them in a crate in the keeper's house and said nothing in the log. The scraping continued, sometimes once per night, sometimes 3 or 4 times. The pattern was irregular. I could not predict when it would start or how long it would last. On the night of November 7th, the scraping changed. I was in the watchroom, winding the clockwork, when the sound began. This time, it did not come from below. It came from higher up, at the level of the gallery that circled the lens. I stopped cranking and listened. The scrape moved in a slow arc around the tower, starting at the seaward side and traveling clockwise. It took nearly a minute to complete the circle. I climbed the last flight of stairs to the gallery and stepped outside. The wind hit me at once, cold and steady from the northeast. The beam turned overhead, throwing light across the rocks and the water. I walked the gallery, checking the iron railing and the glass panels of the lens room. Everything was secure. The scraping stopped. I stood at the seaward rail and looked down. The rocks below were dark and slick with spray. The water heaved in long swells that broke white against the granite. I saw nothing moving, but the air carried a smell I had not noticed before. Salt and rot, heavy and organic, like the low-tide smell of a tidal flat left too long in the sun. I went back inside and locked the gallery door. The iron bolt slid home with a solid click. I made another note in the log. Scraping sound now occurring at gallery level. No visible cause. Will inspect exterior at first light. Morning showed claw marks on the iron railing. They were deep gouges, 3 parallel lines scored into the metal. The marks ran for nearly 2 feet along the seaward side of the gallery. I tested the edges with my finger. They were sharp and clean, not the rough scrapes of rust or corrosion. Something with strength and intent had cut those lines. I inspected the rest of the tower. More marks appeared on the stonework, long scratches that followed the curve of the wall. Some were shallow. Others had bitten deep enough to leave chips of granite scattered on the rocks below. The pattern suggested something climbing, using the wall for purchase. I sent a letter with the next supply boat, addressed to the Lighthouse board in Portland. I described the sounds, the scales, the marks on the railing. I requested instructions and asked if the previous keeper had reported similar occurrences. Briggs took the letter without comment. He said he would return in 2 weeks. He did not ask questions. The scratching began that night. It started just after I trimmed the wick and descended to the watchroom. A light, persistent sound, like fingernails on wood. It came from outside the tower, moving up and down the wall in slow strokes. I stood at the window and looked out. The beams swept the rocks. The water surged. I saw nothing. The scratching circled the tower 3 times, then stopped. I sat in the chair and gripped the arms until my hands ached. The clockwork ticked. The lamp burned. The beam turned. Everything continued as it should, but the air in the watchroom felt heavier, as if something large had pressed close to the tower and left its weight behind. I did not sleep that night. I stayed in the watchroom with the logbook open and a lamp burning on the table. I wrote down every sound, every change in the wind, every shift in the rhythm of the waves. The act of recording kept my hands steady and my mind clear. At dawn, I found wet marks on the gallery floor. They were not water. The substance was thicker, with a faint iridescence that caught the early light. It had pooled in the low spots of the iron grating and left trails where something had moved across the surface. The smell was stronger here, a concentrated version of the rot I had noticed before. I cleaned the marks with rags and seawater, scrubbing until the iron showed clean. I burned the rags in the stove and opened the windows to clear the smell. Then I sat at the table and stared at the scales in the crate. The supply boat did not come in 2 weeks. A storm moved in from the northeast and held the coast for 3 days. Waves broke over the rocks and sent spray high enough to rattle the windows of the keeper's house. The wind screamed through the gallery railing. I kept the lamp burning and the lens turning, climbing the stairs every 4 hours to wind the clockwork. The tower shook with each heavy swell, but the structure held. On the second night of the storm, the knocking began. It started low on the tower, a slow, deliberate rhythm. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I was in the watchroom, wrapped in a blanket against the cold, when the sound cut through the wind. I stood and listened. The knocking repeated, louder this time, as if whatever made it had moved higher on the wall. I climbed to the gallery and looked out. The storm had turned the sea into a churning mass of white and black. Rain drove horizontally across the rocks. The beam barely penetrated 10 yards before the weather swallowed it. I could see nothing below, but the knocking continued, steady and rhythmic, moving up the tower toward the lens. I went back inside and bolted every door. I sat in the watchroom with my back to the wall and my hands in my lap. The knocking reached the gallery level and circled the tower twice. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I sat through the rest of the night without moving. The storm battered the coast. The lamp burned. The clockwork ticked. At dawn, the wind began to ease. By mid-morning, the sea had calmed enough to show whitecaps instead of walls of water. I found scales on the gallery floor, arranged in a line from the door to the seaward railing. 6 of them, evenly spaced, as if placed with care. The storm cleared by evening. The supply boat arrived the next day. Briggs tied up at the dock and unloaded crates of provisions. He asked if I had weathered the blow without trouble. I told him the tower had held. I did not mention the knocking or the scales. He handed me a letter from the Lighthouse board. The letter was brief. The board acknowledged my report and stated that the previous keeper had made no mention of unusual occurrences. They suggested that storm debris or seal activity might account for the sounds. They recommended continued vigilance and regular maintenance. The letter was signed by a clerk I did not know. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. Briggs asked if I needed anything beyond the standard supplies. I said I did not. He said he would return in 3 weeks. Then he left, and I was alone again. The knocking returned that night, but this time it matched my footsteps. I was climbing the stairs to wind the clockwork when I heard it. 3 steps, then 3 knocks from outside the tower. I stopped. The knocking stopped. I took another step. A single knock answered. I continued up the stairs, and the knocking followed, matching my rhythm exactly. I reached the watchroom and sat down. The knocking circled the tower at the same level, keeping pace with my position. When I moved to the window, it moved to the seaward side. When I returned to the table, it returned to the landward wall. I lit the lamp and opened the log. My hand shook as I wrote, "It has learned to knock in the rhythm of my footsteps." I stopped moving. The knocking stopped. I sat in the chair and waited. The clockwork ticked down. The weights descended. The lamp burned low. I did not wind the mechanism. I did not trim the wick. I sat in the watchroom and listened to the tower settle around me. At midnight, the scraping began again. This time, it came from directly above, on the roof of the lens room. Long, grinding strokes that moved from the apex down toward the gallery. I heard the iron roof panels flex under weight. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. I climbed the stairs to the lens room and stood beneath the turning light. The scraping continued overhead, moving in slow circles. The glass panels of the lens vibrated with each stroke. I could hear breathing now, deep and wet, coming through the ventilation gaps in the roof. I backed down the stairs and locked the lens room door. I descended to the keeper's house and gathered what I could carry: the log, a lantern, a knife, 3 days of hardtack and water. I did not look back at the tower. I walked along the rocks to the leeward side of the point and found a cleft in the granite where I could shelter. The beam continued to turn through the night. The scraping stopped near dawn. When full light came, I returned to the tower and climbed to the lens room. The roof panels were bent inward. Long scratches covered the iron, deep enough that I could see the wood sheathing beneath. I wound the clockwork and refilled the lamp. I cleaned the lens and made repairs where I could. I worked through the day without stopping. At dusk, I lit the lamp and started the beam turning. Then I went back to the cleft in the rocks and waited. The supply boat found me 3 days later. Briggs said he had seen the light burning and assumed I was at my post. He said the lens looked clean. He asked why I was sitting on the rocks with my gear packed. I told him I was leaving. He did not argue. We loaded the boat in silence. I left the log on the table in the keeper's house, the scales in the crate, and my boots by the door. Briggs asked if I wanted to take anything else. I said no. He started the motor and turned the bow toward Portland. I did not look back at the tower. I did not ask who would take the posting next. I sat in the stern and watched the wake spread behind us until the point disappeared into the haze. The Lighthouse board sent a new keeper within the week. He lasted 11 days.